The man who traded his reflection. Once upon a time, in a distant land where mirrors were rare and treasured, there lived a man named Solène who had never seen his own reflection. His village had no glass, and the lake was always rippled by wind. He grew up guided only by how others reacted to him: compliments, criticism, comparisons. But he never truly knew what he looked like. But one day, a merchant came through the village carrying a silver-framed mirror. "This is no ordinary glass," he said. "It shows not just your face, but who you've become." Solène felt something ache inside him. He asked the price. "Your most precious possession," the merchant replied. Solène thought of his tools, his books, his home. Then he thought of something deeper: his reputation. He was seen as strong, confident, always in control. To see who he really was might undo all of that. But then he agreed. "I trade you my image," he whispered, "for the truth." He stood before the mirror. At first, just a face. Then it shifted. Wrinkles of worry he never admitted. Eyes that hid grief behind charm. A jaw set not in strength, but in fear of being weak. He almost looked away. Therefore he stared harder. Not to judge, not to retreat, but to understand. And the longer he looked, the gentler his reflection became. Not because the mirror changed, but because he began to accept what he saw. And then, when he turned away, he didn't ask the merchant to return his reputation. He no longer needed to be admired. He had seen himself and chosen to stay. The moral of the story is this: the real transformation begins not when others see you differently, but when you finally see yourself clearly and don't look away. The music box that played only when forgotten. Once upon a time, in a quiet antique shop at the end of a crooked street, there sat a small, dusty music box on the highest shelf. It didn't have a key, no label, no price tag. People overlooked it, drawn instead to louder, shinier things. The owner, an old man with clouded eyes, never spoke of it until someone asked, "What song does it play?" He smiled faintly. "The one you've forgotten." But no one believed him. They wound other toys, bought other clocks. The music box sat untouched, gathering dust, waiting. One rainy evening, a woman named Leora stepped inside. She looked tired, not the kind of tired sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from pretending to be fine for too long. She wandered through the store until her eyes landed on the forgotten box. "I don't know why, but it feels familiar," she whispered. But then, as her fingers brushed the lid, it opened gently, by itself. And it played, a melody so soft, so hauntingly familiar, she felt her throat tighten. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain, but from memory. It was the lullaby her mother used to hum when she was a child, before time and grief erased the sound. Therefore, she stood there, unmoving, as the music wrapped around her like arms once lost. She didn't ask how the box knew. She didn't need to. She bought nothing that day, except silence and a quiet ache that somehow made her feel whole. And then, when she walked out into the rain, she wasn't lighter. She was realer, as if some forgotten piece had come home inside her. The moral of the story is this: some memories don't disappear. They wait quietly until you're ready to feel them again. A chair that faced the wall. Once upon a time, in a modest home at the edge of a gray city, there was a small wooden chair placed oddly in a room, not by a window, not at a table, but facing a blank wall. Visitors found it strange. Why not turn it toward the sun? Why not watch the street? The owner, an elderly woman named Jun, would simply smile and say, "This is where I meet myself." But after she passed, her grandson Liam inherited the house, a fast-paced city dweller. Liam believed in progress, not stillness. He nearly threw the chair out. Yet something stopped him. He sat in it, just once, to understand. But then, the minutes dragged. There was nothing to scroll, nothing to look at. Just white wall, silence, himself. He grew restless, uncomfortable, then uneasy. Because without distraction, the wall became a mirror, not of appearance, but of thought. Therefore he kept sitting, not every day, but often, and little by little. The wall became a place where truths surfaced, where guilt softened, where hopes returned, where the noise of the world paused long enough for his own voice to speak. And the chair stayed facing the wall. And then, years later, when his own daughter asked, "Why does this chair face nothing?" he smiled, like his grandmother once had, and said, "Because sometimes nothing is the only place we truly see what matters." The moral of the story is this: stillness is not absence, it is presence without escape. The tree that remembered every goodbye. Once upon a time, at the edge of a quiet village, stood a solitary tree. It wasn't the tallest or the oldest, but it had a reputation. The villagers called it the farewell tree. Couples broke up beneath it. Soldiers said goodbye to their families beside it. Children cried their last tears for lost pets under its shade. The tree never blossomed, never bore fruit, just stood, still, listening. But one spring, a woman named Amara returned to the village after 20 years. Her hair had grayed, her eyes had changed, but as she stepped off the bus, the first place she walked to was the tree. She placed her hand on its bark and whispered, "Do you remember me?" No wind, no answer, just silence. But then, a breeze stirred the leaves, and something strange happened. A small flower, white, fragile, trembling, bloomed on the branch above her. It was the first bloom anyone had ever seen. Amara smiled through tears. "I thought you might." Therefore, she visited the tree each day, telling it the stories she had held in all those years away. Lost love, broken dreams, silent victories, unspoken regrets, and slowly, more flowers came. Villagers noticed. One by one, people began to visit the tree not just to say goodbye, but to say what they had never said. Apologies, forgiveness, truths buried for decades. And then, something shifted. The tree no longer stood for endings. It stood for release, for letting go, not to forget, but to remember with peace. The villagers gave it a new name. Not the farewell tree, but the listening tree. The moral of the story is this: some things don't need to be fixed, they just need to be heard. A door that only opened inward. Once upon a time, in the center of a quiet monastery atop a windswept hill, there was a door unlike any other. It had no knob on the outside, no keyhole, no sign, just smooth, aged wood and the faint symbol of a spiral etched into its center. Many visitors came to the monastery seeking wisdom, and many asked, "What's behind the door?" The monks would always answer the same: "Whatever you bring with you," but most scoffed. "Nonsense," they said, "it's either locked or empty." Still, once a year the monks allowed someone to try. One year, a man named Corin came. He was respected, wealthy, admired by many, but restless. "I've achieved everything," he said, "except peace." He asked to enter the door. But then, when he placed his hand on the wood, nothing happened. He pushed, he pressed, he even shouted. The door didn't budge. Frustrated, he turned to the head monk. "How do I open it?" The monk said softly, "It opens only from the inside." Therefore, Corin stayed. Days turned into weeks. He swept floors, cooked meals, sat in silence. Without distraction or applause, his mind began to quiet. He stopped performing. He started reflecting. He listened to the wind, to his breath, to the stillness he'd always drowned in noise. And then, weeks later, he returned to the door. No effort, no force. He simply stood before it, and it opened. Inside was no treasure, no miracle, just a mirror. But this time, Corin didn't flinch. He smiled and whispered, "There you are." The moral of the story is this: some doors don't open by force, but by presence, and the deepest truths are found when we go inward, not outward. The shelf of unfinished books. Once upon a time, in a dusty corner of a public library, there was a shelf filled with old, half-finished books. Their pages were yellowed, their spines cracked. But what made this shelf unique was not its condition. It was its contents. Every book was someone's story, not fiction. Real people's lives. And each one stopped mid-sentence. No one checked them out. No one dared. But one day, a lonely woman named Celeste wandered into the library during a thunderstorm. She wasn't looking for a book. She was just trying to escape the rain. Something about that shelf drew her in. She picked up a book. The title read, "The Life of Someone Who Almost Tried." She opened it. It began with a man dreaming of becoming a painter. By page 47, it ended with, "He stared at the blank canvas for years, and then chose to forget." Celeste blinked. "That's it," she whispered. But then, the librarian appeared, an old woman with gentle eyes. "No one finishes those books," she said. "They're waiting for someone to do it." Celeste looked at the shelf. Each title felt oddly familiar. The girl who always waited for the right time. The man who needed permission to begin. She found one labeled only Celeste. Her hands shook. The pages were filled with things she had once loved. Writing, music, travel, dreams she'd delayed for years. And the last sentence simply read, "She is still deciding." Therefore, Celeste checked the book out and went home, not to read it again, but to add the next page. She wrote. She called a friend. She bought a train ticket. She painted. The next month, she returned the book, not unfinished, but with a ribbon at the end. A new title had appeared on the cover, "The One Who Finally Did." And then, the shelf changed. One by one, others began to open their own books, not out of fear of what they hadn't done, but with wonder for what they still could. The moral of the story is this: your life doesn't have to stay half-written. You hold the pen. The lantern that burned only in the dark. Once upon a time, in a quiet village surrounded by mountains, there was a rumor about an old lantern hidden deep in the forest. They said it didn't light with fire or oil, only with darkness. No one had seen it in generations. Most thought it was just a tale told to children afraid of the woods. But one winter, a woman named Marin, who had recently lost everything, her job, her home, her partner, left the village in the middle of the night, drawn by that legend. "What's left to fear?" she whispered to herself. "I'm already in the dark." She walked into the forest with only a match and her grief. But then, as the trees thickened and her path disappeared, the match blew out. She was swallowed by pitch-black silence. Her breath trembled. She couldn't see, couldn't feel the way forward. That's when she saw it, a faint glow floating ahead. A lantern, no wick, no flame, just soft golden light, born from the darkness around it. She approached. It pulsed gently, like it was breathing. Therefore, Marin picked it up. It didn't warm her hands, but it lit her way. With every step deeper into the forest, it glowed stronger. Not because the way was easier, but because the dark was heavier. Eventually, the trees parted, the stars returned, and the lantern dimmed. She looked back at the path. The forest remained as dark as ever, but she was no longer afraid. And then, she realized something strange. The lantern hadn't guided her out. She had guided herself through, and the lantern had only reflected her willingness to keep walking. When Marin returned to the village, she didn't bring the lantern. She didn't need to. she had become one. The moral of the story is this: some lights are not found in spite of darkness, but because of it. The bridge that waited. Once upon a time, there was a bridge that connected two towns, both alike in pride and stubborn in silence. For 50 years, the towns had not spoken. Not because of war, but because of something more common, hurt feelings that no one wanted to mend. And so the bridge sat unused. No footsteps, no wagons, no greetings across the water. Moss grew between the stones. Birds nested in its beams. Time wore at the wood, but it did not collapse. It waited. But one spring, a child from the eastern town wandered too far chasing a paper kite. The wind tugged it over the river. The child followed onto the bridge. From the other side, an old man from the western town saw him. His heart skipped. "No one has crossed in decades," he muttered. But then, the wind picked up again. The kite snagged on a broken railing. The child cried, unsure what to do. The old man stepped forward, slowly, his cane tapping against the stones. The bridge creaked. The birds fluttered. He reached the child and freed the kite. They stood there, one small, one bent with age, on the bridge that had forgotten the sound of voices. Therefore, the child smiled and said, "Thank you." And the old man, after a long pause, said, "You're welcome." The wind stopped. The silence between the towns broke, not with a shout, but with a whisper. And then others began to follow. First, curious children. Then, cautious parents. Then neighbors who remembered each other's names. The bridge was repaired, not just with tools, but with words. The bridge hadn't broken. The people had. And now, they were walking back to each other. The moral of the story is this: sometimes, what separates us is not distance, but the silence we let grow. Healing begins with the courage to cross over. The man who sold silence. Once upon a time, in a bustling city where noise never slept, lived a man named Oren, who owned a small booth tucked between flashing signs and shouting vendors. But Oren didn't sell food or gadgets. He sold something people didn't know they needed: silence. On a small chalkboard beside his booth, it read, 5 minutes of silence, $5. No one understood. Most walked past, laughing. But one day, a woman named Ria, exhausted from meetings, phones, and responsibilities, stopped. "What do you mean silence?" she asked skeptically. Oren smiled. "Just sit. No talking, no phones, no noise. Just you in the quiet." But then, she sat down. The world continued to bustle outside, but inside Oren's soundproof booth, time softened. No buzzing, no pressure, just her own breathing. When the timer dinged, she blinked as if waking from a dream. "That's it? That's everything," said Oren. Therefore, word began to spread. People who never paused now came in for 5, 10, even 15 minutes. A lawyer, a teacher, a taxi driver, all craving the same invisible thing: peace. Some cried, some laughed, some said nothing, but they came back. Oren never spoke about his past. No one knew why he'd chosen this strange service, until one evening, when a journalist finally asked, "Why silence?" Oren looked out at the chaotic street. "Because once, I lost someone who kept screaming for help in silence, and I was too loud to hear them." And then, he said no more. But the next day, a line was longer than ever. Not for a spectacle, but for a moment of stillness, of honesty, of breath. The moral of the story is this: in a world full of noise, silence is not emptiness. It is space to hear what truly matters. The whisper of the unsent letter. Once upon a time, in a dusty drawer inside a cluttered apartment, sat a letter. It had been written 10 years ago by a woman named Ilara, but never sent. The envelope was addressed to someone named Jonah. No stamp, just a trembling hand's handwriting. Alara had written it after Jonah left suddenly, with no goodbye. She had poured her heart into it. Rage, sorrow, hope, love, all bottled up in ink. But when it came time to mail it, she folded it away. "What good will it do?" she had said. "He won't read it. He won't care." And so the letter sat, silent, unopened, forgotten. But then, one rainy afternoon as Alara was cleaning, she found the drawer and froze. Her breath caught. The letter was still there, yellowing but intact. She read it slowly, expecting it to hurt. Instead, it healed. It wasn't about Jonah anymore. It was about who she had been, what she had feared, and what she had needed to say back then. She didn't cry. She smiled. "I thought I was writing this to him, but I was really writing it to myself." Therefore, Alara sat down and wrote a new letter, not to Jonah this time, but to herself. She wrote about how far she had come, how she no longer needed answers from someone who had left, how she had become her own closure. And this one, she mailed, to her current address. And then, 3 days later, she opened the mailbox and found it, her own words returned to her like a gift from her past. She read it aloud, then tucked it into her journal. Not to hide it away, but to remember. Some healing doesn't come from being heard, but from finally listening to yourself. The moral of the story is this: not all letters are meant to be sent. Some are meant to be written, so we can finally hear what our own heart needs to say. Thank you for listening. Receiving a supportive message is much appreciated.